let us consider the land of Egypt, but more importantly, the ancient land of Egypt. We tend to think of Egypt now as a nation, defined by modern borders. However, historically, in the ancient times, Egypt was defined by at least two distinct areas, culturally and environmentally, those areas being Lower and Upper Egypt. In Upper Egypt, the desert came right up to the bank of the Nile River. There was a very thin strip of fertile land. During the annual season of the Nile flood, this had a very different impact on the people of Upper or Southern Egypt. While in Lower Egypt the land was defined by marshes and the delta, and the impact of the flood was quite different in this part of Egypt. So let's go back in history and to the year 3100 BC. The very known, the very well famous Nama palette, which depicts King Nama, the king of Upper Egypt, unifying, or I would imply, reunifying both Upper and Lower Egypt, these two distinct environmental and cultural areas. If we examine the Nama palette, we see quite a few interesting things, and this, well, for instance, okay, we have the goddess Hathor connected to cattle and the bull. Since the earliest time of Egypt, cattle have been present, as with donkeys as well. But importantly, on the Nama palette, we can see the symbol, the hieroglyph of King Nama, the catfish and a chisel, Na-Mer. This is a very important document in several aspects, and we should look at this more closely. Now, this will connect to the god Atum, which is typically depicted with a bull's tail hanging from his belt, as we can see on King Nama, the king of Upper Egypt. Atum is a distinctly Lower Egypt or Northern Egyptian god. He's very prominent in that part of the world, but when we see depictions of Atum, we typically see him wearing the crown of Lower and Upper Egypt. On the Nama palette on one side and the reverse, we see him wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, and we see him wearing the crown of Lower Egypt, the reunification of Egypt. Then we must consider the famous Abydos Kings list, where King Nama, or Mene, is considered to be the first king of a unified Upper and Lower Egypt at least. However, there is quite a bit of important information in regards to that. So pre-dynastic kings, so for instance we have King Ka and Petri and others, well defined. So before King Nama we had King Ka. However, he is not the only pre-dynastic king, at least of Upper Egypt, and this brings us to the point of what defines Egyptian civilization. King Nama or King Ka, well, before him we had King Scorpio, not to be confused with the movie. So for instance, here we see a bowl depicting the King Scorpion carrying the scorpion mace, more importantly. And there is another important feature on this, because we see the 7-petal flower, which we also see on the front piece of the Nama palette. There is also a 6-petaled flower connecting in there as well. This is rather controversial, contentious, because there is a tendency to make King Nama or King Mene the first of the kings to fit in with a certain historical chronology. However, Upper and Lower Egypt, although linked by the Nile River, the environments of these two regions are rather distinct, as are the cultures of Upper and Lower Egypt. Although similar, they are quite distinct. So in Upper Egypt or Southern Egypt, upper as in up the Nile, we have Chemenu, or translates to Eight Town, which was later called Hermonopolis. While in Lower Egypt or Northern Egypt, we have Lunu, the pillars, aka Heliopolis, and this will be an important feature which I'll come to in future episodes regarding the Benben, the flooding cycles, and the navel of the world in the Egyptian respects, and that is Heliopolis. The Greeks were told about the about the Atlantis flood, but according to the legend transmitted by the Egyptians to the Greeks, two pillars containing the knowledge of the antediluvian era, the pre-flood era, were preserved on two pillars that would survive the flood. We see this in organizations such as antediluvian buffaloes and masons. More than just the environment, the cultural differences between Upper and Lower Egypt are rather distinct, and we see them in these important capitals, spiritual cultural capitals. Heliopolis or Lunu in Lower Egypt, and Chemenu, H-Town or Hermonopolis in Upper Egypt. Now we need to bring to the point of the old gods as opposed to the new gods. And the tendency is to focus on Isis, Osiris, and Horus, and this particular story connected to them. However, Horus, Isis, Osiris, and Anubis came to prominence in a later period of Egyptian history. The old gods are different from these new gods. Horus, Isis, Osiris, and Anubis are new gods in this historical aspect of this very long history of Egypt. Egypt is defined by several periods. In Upper or Southern Egypt, Chemenu, H-Town or Hermonopolis, there the primordial gods are defined by the Ogdoad, or the 8 important gods, which are their center of worship being Chemenu, or H-Town, as in the 8 gods, which was later renamed Hermonopolis. Hermonopolis as in Hermes Trismegistus, or as in Hermes, or as in Thoth. While in Lower or Northern Egypt, Lunu, the pillars, aka Heliopolis, was the center of the worship of the 9 primordial gods of the Ennead. Their center being Heliopolis, the 9 gods of the Ennead, as where the 8 gods of the Ogdoad were centered in Upper or Southern Egypt. Completed in 1970, the Aswan High Dam forever ended the age-old cycles of flooding on the Nile River, which defined the culture, the history, the entire lifestyle of both Upper and Lower Egypt. What is interesting is that in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, especially spell 125, the parallels between the 10 Commandments in the Bible, well, are extraordinary. As the Bible, the Book of the Dead, and the Egyptian ancient legends have many interesting parallels, but especially in spell 125 in the Book of the Dead, as relating to the Aswan High Dam. I have not built a dam against flowing water. These are one of the ancient rules, and these ancient rules have been broken in modern times, but you can't stop progress, and this is a feature we'll examine in the future, especially in connection to Heliopolis and how it is now this most sacred of ancient sites, how it opposed to how it was in the ancient times. In ancient Egypt there were 3 seasons, and these seasons were based on the yearly flooding of the Nile cycle. For instance, we had Arket, the inundation or the flood. There we see on the top row we see the symbols of Arket. Especially notice young Horus surrounded by the Urubus. This will be a feature we will examine in the future. But we had Arket, the inundation, the flooding. Following this we had Peret, the growing cycle. And we can see many depictions from the ancient Egyptians themselves, including the use of cattle. They did have pack animals. They had cattle and they had donkeys. This has been a meme which has carried through amongst certain circles that the Egyptians didn't have animals. This is entirely untrue, and actually laughable in the sense that certain researchers would repeat this demonstrably false claim, even with a very short search on Egyptian history. This can be completely debunked, yet it persists. But this was the growing cycle. Following the flood, where silt and nutrients were brought to the land, there would be Peret, the season of growing. Following this, we had the third of the Egyptian seasons, Shemu, or the harvest season, each of these seasons being 120 days. Then we had a 5-day period to make up the 365 days per year cycle, because it was imperative of them that in Archet, or the inundation or the flooding season, that the heliacal rising of Sirius, the star connected to Isis, the star which was aligned to the Great Pyramid, the star which is so important to cultures all across the world, especially in navigation sense. Sirius remains the brightest star in our night sky. That was connected to Archet, the flooding cycle, the inundation cycle. We can also see it in places such as Abu Simbel, that astronomical alignments are embedded in these temples. These seasons, Archet, Peret, and Shemu, had defined Egyptian life since the very beginning. This all changed, of course, in 1970 with the completion of the Aswan High Dam. However, previous to this, we see a very different world. We can see this in the old photos, where the river come right up to the Great Pyramids, where the same Nile River, which defined Egyptian life, also either flooded or came right up to the very boundaries of the sacred and ancient temples. For instance, as we see here, this was the defining lifestyle, the cycle of ancient Egyptian life. There is yet more to come on this, much more, and especially in connection to the flooding, to Heliopolis, the Navel, and the Benben stone. Stay tuned.